I'm very delighted to introduce Susan Gelman as our 20th speaker in our Norman Anderson Distinguished Lecture Series. And as most of you know, each year we're able to bring in a world-renowned scholar for this festive occasion, thanks to the never-ending generosity of Norman Anderson. I was hoping he could be here, but I guess he's not. But maybe we can all give a round of applause for Norman. Susan is the Heinz Werner Distinguished University Professor of Psychology and Linguistics at the University of Michigan. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. She has hundreds of publications and numerous of the most prestigious awards, such as the Eleanor Maccabee Award for her book, The Essential Child. I could probably spend this entire time talking about all of her amazing accomplishments, but I'm not going to do that because I know you want to be able to have time to hear Susan. However, I do want to spend just a couple of minutes telling you about my personal experiences with Susan. So I actually first met Susan in 1985. Before some of you were even born. And I was a freshman at the University of Michigan taking her class, and she was a brand new assistant professor. At the time, I was a pre-med student, certain I was going to go to med school, but her class was fascinating enough that it pulled me toward the field of developmental psychology. So she truly changed my life then and then again later, because our paths crossed again about a decade later, after I had completed my PhD in psychology and was trying to figure out what to do. At the time, I knew I was not ready to be an assistant professor, in part because I had 2 young children at the time and was completely overwhelmed, and I called Susan for her advice and assistance, and she just immediately took me under her wing and guided me through an NRSA postdoc application that allowed me to work with her for 3 years at Michigan. It was the most amazing experience ever. I'm just so lucky to have that opportunity. And she's been a mentor for me, throughout that time and ever since then. Susan's absolutely the platonic ideal of an advisor. She is, the number of projects she juggles is just amazing. And in every single meeting with every student I've ever heard of, she's on top of all the details and excited about the projects, and is just the most supportive person I have ever met in my life, which is one of the reasons why everyone who knows Susan reminds me about how lucky I was to have had the opportunity to work with her, and why everyone who's ever worked with her, and I mean everyone, I challenge you to find any exceptions, says she's just this amazing person. So Susan's intellectual curiosity seems boundless to me, and this is really a small subset of the topics she works on, so I'm just going to list a couple of examples. Psychological essentialism, generics, beliefs about witchcraft, food preferences, parent-child conversations, causal reasoning, gender categories, beliefs about illness, numerical knowledge, naive physics, naive biology, language and thought, and I really could go on and on. In all of these topics, Susan addresses fundamental questions about how we use evidence that's in the world around us to make sense of the world, and her work, all of this work deeply informs our understanding of how we think and how we learn and think. And today, Susan's going to tell us about how children look beyond the obvious. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Gail. That was a really moving introduction, and I remember the period when you were in Ann Arbor is a real highlight. It was so much fun to work together then. And thank you for inviting me to this lecture. It means a lot to me. It's been so much fun to talk to different people in the department yesterday and today, and thank you for inviting me. So one thing that we know that human adults are very good at is looking beyond the obvious. So, you see these pictures and you see, okay, some bananas, this is UCSD students. I try to be topically appropriate. The night sky, a glass of water. We see we see things around us that are very apparent. But we also know that in each of these cases, there's something non-obvious underlying structure that in many cases reflects some of the really foundational scientific discoveries over many generations. So things like DNA, activation in the brain, gravitational forces, and the chemical structure of matter. So a key question I think this raises is, given how important and vast these kinds of discoveries have been for adults, where does this way of thinking about the world come from? How do we form these sort of representations of reality that go beyond what we can see to allow us to make these really important discoveries? And there's a standard model. This goes back to the British empiricists. It goes back to Jean Piaget, which says that there's a really foundational shift from childhood to adulthood, where children think about just the overt perceptual qualities of things, and it's not until later that people can think about concepts. Children are focused on the obvious. Adults can extend to the non-obvious. Children care only about surface features. Adults care about deeper reality. Children are concrete. Adults are abstract. And I think, there's some truth to this, in that children are very readily captured by outward appearances. Children are often misled by how things look. There are many examples of this on all kinds of psychological tasks. But the main message of what I want to talk about today is really to challenge that view. So to make it memorable, that this way of thinking of children and adults is really like having these opposed sorts of representations, and children as unable to think about the non-obvious is oversimplified, it's wrong, and that there are some really foundational ways that we think about the world from a very young age in terms of abstract or non-obvious sorts of features. So the plan for my talk is that I will try to illustrate this point with 3 examples. I will talk about category essentialism, generic language, and object history, and I'm really going to treat them as 3 distinct kind of lines of research. There are some ways in which I think they intersect in interesting ways that we could talk about later if you want. But in each of these cases, the point will be the same, which is we see young children reasoning about the world in ways that go beyond what they can see. So I'll start with category essentialism, and that's, of course, very jargony, so I want to go from like technical terminology to illustrating what I mean by this. So I want to start with an example from popular culture. This is Caitlyn Jenner. As you may know, she's a transgender woman who was born male. So she used to be Bruce Jenner, who was an Olympic athlete. So Jenner looks like a woman. She identifies as a woman. She has a female name. But some people feel very strongly that she's not a woman and in fact could never be a woman. And so you can find this kind of position expressed where else on the internet. And so I'm going to read you some quotes, and you'll see the kind of reasoning here, and to argue that that Caitlyn Jenner is in fact a man. We're told this is Bruce's new self, but he can't have a new self. He has only one self, and the self he has is a he, no matter how much plastic surgery he gets. His girlish looks are only skin deep, but his maleness goes all the way to the bone. What would a chromosome analysis say? That he's a male, and therefore he will always be one until he dies. So if you were to kind of map out what the representation here is, you would say that, okay, there's a certain appearance that this person has, but there's also a deeper reality that is connected to that appearance. And there's some quality, which we might call the essence, that gives rise to one's appearance as well as a deeper reality. And this is what I mean by psychological essentialism. So in the case of gender, what this might look like for Caitlyn Jenner is her surface appearance is female, her reality is of a male, and chromosomes are responsible for that deeper reality, which may be masked in terms of surface appearance, but it doesn't change the deeper reality. Now, interestingly, something similar is going on with how Jenner sees herself. It's different, but on some level it's the same. So she wrote an autobiography recently about her life, and here's what she had to say. Has my gender always been female? Yes. I was a fraud when it came to being my authentic self. Imagine denying your core and soul. So although she's coming to an opposite categorization decision from the people on the internet who denied that she is female, she again seems to have the same kind of underlying structure, but this time regarding her transgender identity. So you could map it out as her male appearance was only superficial. The deeper reality is female, and there's some sort of underlying essence, although she never identifies what it is, but at least we know it's not chromosomes. So this is kind of basically what I mean by essentialism. And we know from a lot of work with adults that if you come right out and ask people whether or not they accept these kinds of beliefs, adults endorse essentialism. There's variation, to be sure, and that's an interesting question unto itself. But for the most part, many adults will agree to statements like these. Everyone is either male or female. There's nothing in between. It's not easy to change this category. It's fixed. Differences between men and women in behavior and personality are largely determined by genetic predisposition. So you see the idea that categories have kind of a deep divide between them. Things fall into one category or another. They're stable. They have a biological basis. And there are other kinds of essentialist propositions as well. And so I illustrate here with gender, but I want to be clear, this is not just about gender. So people have examined essentialism about race, math ability, personality, musical talent, psychiatric classifications. It's a widespread way of thinking about categories that we see in adults in this culture. I would also argue that essentialism is a cognitive bias. This is something I'd be happy to discuss more if you have questions or if you're like skeptical about that. But one like little piece of evidence about this being a bias is that essentialism encourages people to think about categories in terms of absolute differences rather than statistical distributions. So Janet Hyde and Lynn have done work where they look at the distribution of male and female scores on various sort of like personality measures and other sort of psychological measures, and often they find highly overlapping distributions. That's a D prime of about 0.21, and yet the findings are sometimes characterized as if literally women and men have different kinds of brains. This is an actual image from a news report on an experiment that was done on men and women, and I'm sure that the authors would be horrified if they saw how their data were represented. We also know that essentialism with adults predicts a wide range of social consequences, including stereotyping and prejudice, punitive judgments, racial categorization, and gender imbalances in academia. So I was really interested in this question of why we essentialize. Where is this coming from? And I would argue that it's very, very hard to answer this question if you just look at the adult endpoint. That what can really be valuable and give us insight into why we're doing this is comparative evidence. So we don't just want to look at undergraduates at the University of Michigan. This is a nice typical example. But people from other cultural contexts, and of course especially children who don't yet have the kind of historical background. They haven't been reading Plato and Aristotle. You know, they don't have extensive immersion in this culture. They have some for sure. And so I think that a comparative analysis is really fruitful, and I focused on a developmental comparative analysis. So what I want to do, I've spent a huge portion of my career looking at essentialism in kids. I wrote a book about it. I have a lot of different ways that I've approached this. And so I think what would be useful is for me to kind of run through some of the findings that we have discovered in our lab. And in each case, I'll give you sort of a snapshot of the kinds of things that kids do on one of our experiments. And at the top of each one, I'm going to give you like a quote of what kids would say if they could express what they're doing on these tasks, but not using kid-friendly language. So for example, categories have an underlying reality. This is not anything a 4-year-old would ever tell you explicitly. But this is kind of a summary of what they do on tasks where if you provide them with, say, like a fish, a dolphin, and a fish, they will report that a shark will have the same insides as a tropical fish, even though it looks like a dolphin. They say that nature overrides nurture. So a baby kangaroo over here that's raised by a family of goats will grow up to be good at hopping and not good at climbing. And a boy raised on an island with only women and girls will grow up to like boy activities, such as playing with trucks and playing football. They think that category boundaries are objectively correct. So the only correct way to group these people is to put the two women together. And they say it would not be okay to group the man with one of the women. And this extends to culturally specific ethnic categories. So secular Jewish children in Israel make the same judgments about individuals who are Muslim Arab versus Orthodox Jewish. They see it as an objectively correct classification. They also report that insights matter. So we were very intrigued by a couple of small-scale studies that are scattered in the literature that people had done interviewing people who had undergone a heart-lung transplant and asking them about their beliefs about what they experienced. And what a few people have reported, and there's anecdotal reports as well, in some cases written up in books, where about a third of people who've had heart-lung transplants report the belief that they've taken on personality characteristics of their donor. So it's as if you take that inner part of a person into yourself, that's going to, change you in a really foundational way, as if the essence is there. So we asked kids, we presented them with these hypothetical scenarios where there's like a really mean girl who did who pushed people and laughed if somebody got hurt and that kind of thing. Her name is Mia. If you had Mia's heart inside you, would you end up acting meaner like Mia, or would you stay the same? And we had the main condition that we were interested in was when there was that heart transplant. And then we had a control condition where $1 was exchanged instead of hearts, where we expected that it shouldn't matter if you get the $1 from someone else. And we found that for nice and mean, children said that they would change to become more like the donor. If the donor was nice, they would become nicer. If the donor were mean, they would become meaner. It's not just a belief that the heart carries emotions, because we found the same effect for smart and non-smart, and we found the same effect for monkey and pig. And interestingly, so this study was with kids from 5 to 7, but we also did this research with adults in the US and India and found very similar beliefs among adults. not everybody, about a third of US adults, and about 50% of adults in India also endorse this belief. They didn't think there'd be huge changes for taking on, like, a pig's heart, but small tweaks in a person's behavior. So, to summarize this evidence, children seem to be little essentialists. Even early in childhood, and by early here I'm talking about 4 or 5, concepts are not rooted strictly in observable features. They include a placeholder for another deeper level of analysis. Children seem to expect that these categories that they're learning go beyond what they can see. And a number of people have been looking at different cultural groups and finding similar findings in how people reason about animal categories. This kind of essentialism of animal categories is found broadly across all the areas on the map that are in red. The ones that are not in red haven't been studied yet. It's not that they're not finding it, but they're just, still have yet to be studied. Where people have been finding kind of more substantial differences is in essentialism of social categories. Which social categories are essentialized and to what degree seems to show a lot more variation across different places in the world. So that's also a really interesting question as to why and what leads to those differences. But the basic idea that a category is more than just what you can see is present from an early age quite broadly. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the second example, which is generic language. And I also want to start with an example. Okay, so I'm going to tell you 2 facts that are generally agreed upon. They're not controversial. So fact 1 is that fewer than 1% of mosquitoes in areas where the West Nile virus has been found actually carry the virus. So if like this is a page full of mosquitoes, like that's how often you'd see a mosquito, see the circle down there. Fact 2, mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus. Now I hope that should bother you a little bit. That people make this kind of statement even though it's very rare. This kind of statement is what linguists and philosophers call a generic. Now there's a really deep and interesting story about how generics work, what they mean, how they're learned, what they imply about norms and rules. There's a lot of really good work being done by linguists and philosophers and psychologists on these questions. I'm not going to go into those. For our purposes, I want to talk about how generics refer to kinds, and then the question of how children understand them. So I'll give you some examples. Generics are all over the place. Once you start paying attention to it, you just will see them everywhere. So Wikipedia is filled with generics. This is one that I got the other day. Horses are animals of habit that respond well to regimentation. They're frequent in the kinds of books that we read to children in middle class US context. The elephant is the only mammal that cannot jump. Parents use them all the time talking to their kids. We've done many studies looking at parent conversations to kids, and these are short interactions, about 10 to 15 minutes max, and over 90% of the parents will use a generic at least once in those contexts. Here's a sample. A wok is how people in China cook. And kids themselves start using generics at about 2.5. Do butterflies have bones? This is one a 3-year-old said. And the last example is my favorite generic, partly because one of my kids said it when he was 2.5. His name is Adam. And I told him it's nap time. He said, Adams don't have to take naps. Okay, so So kids are producing these. They're doing it, in inventive ways. And that is actually surprising if you think about it. Because even though these are very common expressions, and even though these seem very ordinary in some ways, there are two really serious challenges for learners. One is that generic reference are unobservable, and I'll say what I mean about that in a minute, and statistical cues seem to be insufficient, and I'll say what I mean about that as well. So, the unobservable. Okay, so consider something like cheetahs run fast. I can show you a cheetah running fast. I could show you 100 cheetahs, 1,000 cheetahs. Thing is, I can never show you cheetahs as a group. This is an abstraction. It includes past, present, future, hypothetical. It's an abstract category. And so there's a sense in which this is really radically different from most word learning contexts, that especially ones that psychologists have studied. So if I want to teach a child a word like bottle, I can hold it up and point to it and say, this is a bottle, and point to, what it is that I am labeling, but I can't point to cheetahs as a group. What do I mean by saying that statistical cues are insufficient? So again, you probably have a sense of this already from the mosquitoes example, but just to play that out a little more. So we can say that birds fly, presumably most birds fly. We can't say books are paperback. This example was before digital books, so that complicates the picture even more. But let's say if you're only talking about physical books, most of them are paperback, but it's a weird kind of sentence. Doesn't seem like a good generalization. We can say lions have mane, only male lions have manes. We can't say lions are male. That sounds strange. We can say ticks carry Lyme disease. Probably in most contexts could not say people earn PhDs, even though, it is true at about the same rate as ticks carrying Lyme disease. So what seems to be going on is that domain-specific theories about categories are overriding just like pure frequency. So one example is that for adults, if there are features of a category that are inherent and inborn, those are privileged when you're interpreting a generic. So we did a little study, I did this with Paul Bloom, where we presented adults with novel categories, like in this case these are dobles. And we said, these are my dobles. And we varied whether a certain distinctive property was either born or acquired through some sort of artificial means. So you may notice that they have claws on their paws, and either they were said to be born with those claws, or they acquired them through an artificial process by putting on gloves that had claws on them. We also varied the prevalence. So the sample of my dobles, either then after this introduction, maintained the property, they all still had claws, or we had a scenario in which they lost their claws through one means or another. So we varied the origins or the prevalence, and we presented them with either a generic question or a non-generic question. So when it was generic, do dobles have claws? Really the only thing that the adults cared about were the origins of the dobles, of the claws, whether they're born or acquired. They didn't care about prevalence at all. When we had a non-generic, do my dobles have claws? All they cared about was prevalence, not origins at all. Domain-specific theories can also override statistics. So for example, generics privilege features that emerge over development. So if you think about the ugly duckling story, it starts out ugly, becomes beautiful over time. We say swans are beautiful. We don't say swans are ugly, even though they are ugly for a portion of their life. So we wanted to test whether this was a general expectation about generic language. So we presented people with novel generic statements. Again, this is with adults. Brables have bumpy skin, for example. And we said your job is to figure out which group are the Brables. And we explained that the ones on the top row in these two groups, so this is one group, this is another group. The ones in the top were the young members of this category, and the ones in the bottom were the adults. And we said, okay, so given this, which do you think are Brables? And notice that on the left, only 33% have bumpy skin, and on the right, 50% have bumpy skin. But there's, it's structured in a way where they develop the bumpy skin with age on the left, and not so on the right. And we found that adults consistently said that these were the Brables. When we had a non-generic, again, generics seem to be special in privileging these sorts of features, just like with the Doble's experiment. With the Brables experiment, if we said, oh, so that was what I said before, that the less frequent property was treated as the referent of the generic. When we had a non-generic quantified statement, most Brables have bumpy skin, then they picked equally between the two. So we know that generic referents are unobservable. We know that statistical cues are insufficient, but children nonetheless learn generics easily. And for children, as for adults, generics are referring to these non-visible abstract kinds. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how we know this. So hopefully you can see that there are two like tiny little elephants in that image. So kids were shown a set of cards one at a time. This would be an example. And they would hear either a non-generic question or a generic question. So it would go like this. Here are two elephants. Now I'm going to ask you a question about the elephants. Are the elephants big or little? And we predicted that they would say little. And here the article "the" is implicitly telling them that it's elephants in this context. It's non-generic in English. The generic condition was very similar, but just a little bit different in the wording. Here are two elephants. Now I'm going to ask you a question about elephants. Are elephants big or little? Here we predicted that they would say big. And again, like just ignore what was there in front of them and make reference to this abstract category. And this is what we found. I'm showing you the data from 2 to 4-year-olds because we actually didn't find any difference across that age range, that when they received the generic wording, elephants, they typically responded in a way that was consistent with the property of the broad category. And when they heard non-generic, such as the elephants, they tended to answer consistent with the picture that was right in front of them. Here's another example, looking at kinds versus frequency. So again, think about the generic statement, birds lay eggs, as contrasted to birds are girls. So I suggested that birds lay eggs is a perfectly good sentence. Birds are girls is not a very good sentence. So if you think about it, male birds don't lay eggs, baby birds don't lay eggs, so it's somewhat less than 50% probably, depending on how many males and females there are in this category, but you're getting most of the members of the category not fitting that generalization. And birds are girls, of course, it would be exactly 50%. So birds lay eggs, from just sheer frequency standpoint, should be less acceptable than birds are girls. And so we had a set of sentences like this. where there was, some sort of gender dichotomy, and we found that adults thought that, the proportion of birds that lay eggs is about 50%, the proportion of birds that are girls are about 50%. But then when we asked kids to endorse birds lay eggs, they generally said that this was a good sentence. Birds are girls, they generally said this was not a good sentence. So kids are sensitive to that same set of principles that underlie the usage of these generics. Statistics can also have an asymmetric influence. This is something that we were very interested to discover in how people think about generics. So, as I've already pointed out, we can assert these generic statements on the basis of really minimal evidence. I've already made this point. But on the other hand, we suspected that generics would imply a really strong link between a category and a property, and therefore high prevalence. So if you make a generic claim about a category, that claim in some ways is saying this is a really important feature. And we thought that people would estimate the prevalence as very high. So we predicted what you might think of as a paradoxical asymmetry, where people would tend to exaggerate prevalence relative to the evidence. Now, we didn't want to test this with things like birds lay eggs or mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus, where people already have a lot of knowledge, and they would, presumably fall back on the facts that they know. So we tested this with novel categories and novel generic statements. So, for example, these are crullets, and we found that if you tell people spots, they generally will say that it's true that crullets have spots. They're perfectly happy with that. They don't think it has to be without exception. 70%, good. I will happily accept that generalization. However, if we tell people crullets have spots, they guess that 95% of crullets have spots. This is very consistent, across a range of categories. And so that gap between 70% and 95% is what we're calling the asymmetry. That generics have this ability to kind of not worry about the exceptions is, kind of leading to this asymmetry in interpretation. And so we've looked at this with adults and with children, younger children who are 4 and 5, older children who are 7 to 11. We find this asymmetry in all of the age groups that we studied. And when we look at quantifiers like all, most, some, that seem similar to generics in a lot of ways, there is an exception here, the older children with most. But in all the other cells, we did not get the asymmetry. So I think there may be real-world implications of this generic asymmetry that may lead to miscommunication without people even realizing that it's going on. So think about statements that you could think of as sexist or racist or other isms. Girls don't like math. Someone can make a claim like that on the basis of, maybe partial evidence. Some girls that they've encountered who don't like math, not being worried by the exceptions, but then when kids hear this, they may assume that it's very broadly true. Political discourse, a statement like nuclear power is dangerous. Someone who states that may have one belief about the actual incidents of dangerous implications of using nuclear power. A person who hears that may have a very different interpretation of that. So people may agree on the evidence and disagree about the generic, or people may agree with the generic but have different beliefs about the prevalence of these statements. And I think this may be true in scientific communication as well. So this is, I don't mean to pick on anybody, and I will say, after doing this research, I have come to realize that I too use generics when I write up papers. But this is a sentence from an abstract. Switching from a global default to a local processing state is impaired in older age. And of course, this doesn't mean that every older person necessarily is showing that effect. It's a generalization that allows for exceptions. And we have a project going on now where we're looking at, this is with Jasmine DeJesus, who's a postdoc at Michigan, Maureen Callanan, who's at UC Santa Cruz, and her student Graciela Solis. We're looking at the incidence of generic statements to communicate research results across different subfields of psychology. And we're also very interested in how often people use these generics, which you could think of as kind of oversimplifying, when they're given more space to write up the results, like an abstract, versus less space to write up the results, like in research highlights. So those research highlights have to be bullets and very short. Okay, so for generic language, I would argue that generics refer to concepts that are fundamentally abstract and non-obvious. But for preschool children as well as adults, generic language reflects theory-based knowledge. Okay, so now I'm going to my last example, my last set of findings on object history. So I want you to look at this bag. I want you to think for a minute about what your representation of this object is. So maybe it would include its shape, color, parts. You might be thinking about its function. You might be thinking about its aesthetics, the style, how clean or dirty it is. And I'm wondering if it would surprise you to learn that somebody described it like this. It is hard to imagine anything more exciting. That's because this was a bag that Neil Armstrong used on his Apollo 11 mission. And actually, shortly after he died, his widow found it in a closet. She didn't know it was there. So she discovered it, she told NASA, they were thrilled, it was exciting. Okay, why is that? It's not because of what it looks like. I can't imagine a less exciting object visually, but it is thrilling to think that this object was on the moon, that it has dust from the moon. I mean, that is so, that the history of the object gives it this significance that it wouldn't otherwise have. And this is an idea that really resonates broadly in poetry as well as real world events. I love this quote from Pablo Neruda, who's a poet, who said, "All things bear the traces of someone's fingers on their handle or surface, the trace of a distant hand lost in the depths of forgetfulness." And, if you think about it, we know that object history is non-obvious. You can't see the history of an object. And we know that it imparts value. So all of these objects are in the Smithsonian Museum. It's a dress that Phyllis Diller wore. Those of you of my generation will know who that is. If not, you can Google it later. Abraham Lincoln's hat. Albert Einstein's pipe. And of course, Muhammad Ali's robe and whatever you call those things. I don't know anything about sports, sorry. So they're in the museum. Why are they in the museum? Again, because of their history. And I think there's interesting evidence, preliminary interesting evidence, that it's really the history of the item and not just its association that's critical. The reason I say this is based on this really interesting study by George Newman and Paul Bloom, came out a few years ago, where they looked at actual celebrity auctions, like I think it, it's one of these auction houses that sells like top of the line kinds of items. And what they did was for each item, they were associated with these 3 characters. So John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, and does anybody know who this is?
Bernie Madoff.
It was Madoff. Okay. And you may notice the slope is different from Madoff. I'll get to that in a second. So for each item, they first had, and this is like all objective and published, in the catalogs. They had first what the price was of what they thought the item was worth, what they expected it to get, and then they had the actual price that it sold for at auction. Separately, they had a bunch of adults rate how much they thought each item would have been in contact with this famous person. So some of the things were like very personal items that would have been like in contact with the person's skin, most likely, and others were things that maybe like would have been on the wall, that they wouldn't have had that much contact with. And they basically found small but somewhat reliable effects on with the closer the physical contact was as rated by naive adults, the higher the price was for the 2 positive characters. And this is non-significant, but it's sort of provocative that it goes the opposite way with Madoff, suggesting that perhaps the idea is maybe this history sort of rubs off in either a positive or negative way. So we were really interested to know, like, at what point in development do kids seem to have this same hypervaluation of objects that have special history? So we described, for example, and this is just one of our items. It was actually the item that was the most consistently powerful in terms of kids' answers. And this was back when Obama, we ran this when Obama was still president, and he was actually, I would say, maybe a high point of popularity at that point when we actually ran it. And we randomly, associated either one flag pin or another with either the president. If you know that the president likes to wear a pin with a flag on it, this is the president's favorite flag pin that he likes to wear. Or a flag pin that was said to be owned by just like a random adult. The experimenter would say, did you know that my dad likes to wear a pin with a flag on it? This is my dad's favorite flag pin that he likes to wear. And then we asked kids to say how much they thought each item was worth. So the mean rating for the dad's flag pin was $98. If you want to make a lot of money, find a rich kid selling things. For Obama, the mean was $657. And we had to log transform the values in order to analyze the data. So there's a sense of, and here are the overall data. So the youngest group was kindergarten to first grade. Below that, they weren't able to be consistent in giving us monetary judgments. Half the kids were. It wasn't, they weren't consistent enough that we could test it younger. But this is it's the authentic, their value for the authentic minus the inauthentic log transformed dollar. And you can see they're all positive at all of the ages. And then just to make sure it's not just something about old things, we also asked about old things that didn't have any special history, and those were, except for the 6th graders, not sure why whether that's interesting or just like a fluke. But those were typically rated as less valuable if they're just old. In fact, we did a study recently with 3-year-olds where we had them bring in objects, toys that they owned from home, often very raggedy objects, and we compared it to a brand new object of the same type. This was such a pain to do this study. We had to get the pictures from the parents ahead of time. We had to then go like find matching objects and everything. But what we found was that when there were objects that where the old one was, so I'm showing you preferences for the old object in the pair. There's always an old object versus a new object. When the focal pairs are the ones where the old object was a child's object from home, the children consistently preferred their object to the new object. They wanted the old tattered object, not the new object, but they reported that the researcher would want the new one, not the old one. So they knew that it was their personal preference, but they still felt that the old object had value. Control pairs where the old object was from the lab and the new object was from the lab, so there were neither one that the child had a history with. They always preferred the new object, and they thought that the researcher would prefer the new object as well. So it was really this special attachment to objects with which they had a past history. And we also found, we did an experiment where we had kids come into the lab and we'd show them 3 identical objects. We would say, this one's yours, and this one's mine, and here's this one. And then we did like a shell game kind of thing where we transposed these objects through time and space, and then asked the kids which one was yours, which one was mine. Thinking that if kids really didn't care about object history, these are identical objects, none of them are from the child's past. The only history that the kid has with this is that labeling at the very beginning of the trial where we said, this one's yours. If they care about the object history, then they should spontaneously, they were not instructed to pay attention to which was which, they should spontaneously track the object through time and space and then successfully answer which one was theirs. So this is just like a mock-up of what it would look like. This one's yours. Oh no, that's a researcher. So, we varied which one was named first. So say, this one's mine, this one's yours, look at this. And then in some random order, we would put them in this other location. I am representing them as different shapes, but they were identical. That's just for our purposes. So for example, like 3 identical cars. And what we find is that even by 2 years of age, children can correctly report which one was theirs. They were tracking that. They didn't track the other person's object, but then by 3, they're almost as good as adults. We were also interested, so if children are tracking object history, we were interested in the reverse question. Would they search for traces of object history? If they were told, okay, you have to find which one is yours and which one is mine, and we disrupted the spatio-temporal tracking. And I'll show you in a minute how we did it. We made it so that they couldn't track it. Would they just say, like, well, I don't know, I can't tell? Or would they look for traces of the history? Again, linking the object in its current state to some, sort of prior set of events that the object had participated in. So we would have, in this case, there are only 2 objects. Again, this is just a schematic. The researcher would label one as belonging to the participant, one as belonging to the researcher. Then an opaque cover was put on top, and the child had an opportunity to spin it. So you can't really see that, but this is my little, see. Spin it. There, okay. And then take the lid off, and the kid was asked, which one's yours? So we had 3 conditions for this. So there would always be 2 seemingly identical objects, in this case 2 little notebooks. In one case, there was a hidden trace. So the experimenter made a tiny mark in one of the objects. It was either underneath or they closed it up so that the mark was not visible when the child was asked to answer. So if they were thinking about the history as being relevant here, then they would have to like either open up the book or look underneath the object. We also had a tricky condition, which was invisible traces, where the experimenter pretended to give special history to one object by making a mark, only there was actually no mark whatsoever. So the kid had no actual visible trace to look for, and we were interested if they nonetheless looked. And then we had a control where there was no history at all mentioned. It was, you know, this one's mine, this one's yours, so the ownership was presented, but there was no special historical event that only affected one of the objects the way it was in the other 2 conditions. So I'm going to show you kind of how this worked, and then I'll show you the results. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this. It's more important that you see it than you hear it for this one. And so this is already after the experimenter labeled one as belonging to the child and one as belonging to her. And after, this was an invisible traces one, or I remember. So he's doing the spinning. He lifted it. Okay, now, and she asked him to find which one was his. So he's looking, and ultimately picked one. There was nothing for him to find, but you know, he was searching for the traces of the history. And so we did this with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and adults, and looking for hidden traces. This is just a mean number of times that they checked on a given object. They had a bunch of these trials. And when they're invisible traces, that was harder for the kids, not for the adults. And no history control is, you know, kind of what we're comparing it to. There's a weird thing where the adults check even when there's no history. You know, we have some thoughts about what might be going on there. But the important thing is that the 2-year-olds actually did not solve it with invisible traces. That looks different, but it's not. But when there were hidden traces, even the 2-year-olds were looking for the traces of history. And by 3, they're clearly doing it for both hidden and invisible traces, and a little bit better as they got older. We have some recent data where this time we tell them it's a very similar sort of setup, but this time we tell them that there were 2 objects, one that a number of children have played with before, and one that is new. And then, so there's no mark that is applied during the context of the experiment at all. All that they know is that one object has history and one object has no history. I hope that we didn't hear the other one. I don't know. I may have to just like kind of tell you what the kid says. No, that didn't work. Let's see if I can.
Here's the next one.
Okay.
This is yours. This is for Leo. And guess what? It's brand new. See this? Look at this. And guess what? A lot of kids have played with this one. So
yeah,
which one?
This one's dusty or this one's not. And this one's not that dusty, so this one's new.
Alright. Which one is new?
This one.
Alright. Time to spin.
Ready?
yours?
She's looking for the dust.
This
Okay. And of course, they were identical. There wasn't actually an older one. Our control was 2 that were described as brand new. And what we found is, when we asked which one is yours, they were more likely to check when there was a contrast in the differential history than when both of them were new and there wasn't differential history for the kids. Again, the adults are continuing to check. So it's the same sort of thing that we found with the other study. Not sure what's going on with the adults. As I said, I have some ideas. Now, okay, but all of this suggests, in some sense, it is normatively correct to care about the history of objects. But for money, we don't care about the history of objects in certain very important ways. If I put $1 in the bank and I get a different dollar out, that's fine. We don't complain to the bank that we didn't get our original dollar back. So in a way, maybe it shouldn't matter at all for money, what the history is. But we do talk about an honest dollar, dirty money, money laundering. There are some sociological studies that suggest that people sort of compartmentalize money from different sources. And so people spend money differently depending on whether it was a gift or something they earned or something that they earned through maybe unsavory means. So there are reasons to think that maybe we care about the history of money. And in this context, what's particularly important is the question of whether people care about not just the history of the amount of the money, but do they care about the actual physical bill? Is there a sense in which they think the history clings to that bill? So we have a paper with Arbor Tassimi, who's the first author, looking at how kids and adults think about the moral history of money. And the basic idea is we ask people if they want $1 that was stolen or that was not stolen but was offered by a thief. So, everybody agrees it's bad to steal $1. There's no question about that. Even kids understand that. But do you care about the source of money that's offered to you? Or does it get erased because it's money and money's fungible? So we predicted stolen dollar would be undesirable and that the moral history of the object would be more important than the morality of the giver. So we asked this with these little vignettes. So for example, Paul stole $1 from another person. The stolen dollar is in his pocket. Paul has another dollar that he did not steal in his desk. He says you can have the dollar in his desk if you want. So you can think about whether you'd want that or not. Then there's a bad dollar, which is the opposite. Frank's found a stolen dollar in his desk. He says you can have the dollar if you want. And then we had it had both of these negative combined. Brian stole $1. Sorry, Brian. Brian stole $1 from another person. It's in his desk. He says you can have the dollar if you want. And then we had 2 controls, a neutral one, just this guy has $1 in his desk. It's offered to you. Or $1 that someone sneezed on. Gosh, the child explanations for the study were so funny. But we'll get to that. I'm going to start with the adults. How much would you like to have the dollar? Now you can see, so you're already anticipating probably. I showed you with the dollar, we varied whether it was $1 or $100, which turns out to be interesting, I think. So I'll start with the dollar. And I put this box around the bad giver and the bad dollar because the key prediction here is that, this is how much they would want it on a 0 to 7 scale. And if we predicted that they would have lower scores for a bad dollar compared to a bad giver. That the dollar itself, if you have a stolen dollar, possessed by somebody who also has a non-stolen dollar, you're okay with taking the non-stolen dollar. You don't want the stolen dollar. And that's exactly what we found. People most wanted the neutral dollar. They do care. They much less want one from a thief, but if it's, you know, a neutral dollar and a bad giver, it's better than a bad dollar. When they're both bad, that's even worse. And the dirty dollar was the least desired object. Now with $100,
Wait, that $100 bill?
so, yeah, I'm gonna get to that. But so we'll start with the bad giver, bad dollar. Same result. So they still, and in fact, the effect seemed a bit bigger there. They really didn't want even a $100 bill. You might think, well, you know, $1, it's not a lot of money. $100 is like, you know, a pretty big amount of money. They really didn't want it. And in fact, when we compared, does changing it from $1 to $100 make you want it more, it mattered in 3 out of the 5 cases, specifically the 3 cases where the dollar is not morally tainted, if you will. The 2 cases where the dollar is morally tainted, they did not, or the $100, they did not want it. And so there's no benefit for it being $100 in these 2 cases. Dirty dollar is the most dramatic increase. Like, it's $1. Oh no, I would never want something that somebody sneezed into. $100, sure, I'll just wash it off. But there was a sense in which they couldn't wash off the moral history. Okay. 75% of adults would accept the neutral dollar from the bad giver. Their explanations were interesting. I'd feel weird, but as long as it's not the stolen product, I wouldn't feel any moral obligation to refuse. Since it's not the dollar that was stolen, I will take it, as strange as that seems. Like, the person is like, at some level thinking this doesn't make sense, but it's, you know, they're reporting how they think. Okay, so what about kids? So we had 2 age groups. I'm going to start with our older group of kids. They're 8 to 9 years of age. Again, I'm boxing the important comparison. And in this case, it was a scale 0 to 2 because they could either say that they didn't want it or they did want it. And then if they said they did want it, they said, do you want a little or a lot? So if they said no, it would be 0. If they said yes, a little, it would be 1. If they said yes, a lot, it would be 2. And of course, these are averaged over kids. So again, what we find is that kids avoided the bad dollar. In fact, no child ever wanted the bad dollar. Now, they're very squeamish about accepting any dollar. So they, you know, a lot of kids just like said no across the board, but they are especially negative about the bad dollar, just like the adults. Okay, so now what about the 5 to 6-year-olds? The younger children were happy to take the stolen dollar. You know, you might say, like, this is like the economic ideal. You know, it's like money is fungible. It doesn't matter. We found in another, we wanted to make sure it wasn't that they thought it was okay to steal. And they, you know, with these vignettes, they said that the person shouldn't have taken the dollar and should return it. But they don't think that, like, the moral history carries over to the person who is offered the dollar. And it's not that they're not sensitive, because they really don't want the dirty dollar, but they're fine with these bad dollars. And I'm going to play a little clip from a kid who's being interviewed.
So this is Brian. Brian stole $1 from another person.
Oh, that's me.
Did Brian steal the dollar?
Yeah.
That's right, Brian stole the dollar. So Brian says you can have the dollar if you want.
Okay.
Do you want the dollar?
Yeah,
Do you want it a little bit or a lot?
a lot.
And why?
Because I like dollars.
And I don't know if you heard the very end. After he said I like dollars, he said something like I can buy things. Okay. So object history. So for young children as for adults, object representations seem to include these invisible ties to their history. This affects their attention, memory, and valuation of objects. And by 8 to 9 years, this even extends to reasoning about money. And the younger children seem to be more rational economic actors. There's something going on with the younger children that's really different from the older children and adults. So I want to draw just a few general conclusions. So this is just what I've already just presented to you about how children transcend the here and now in different ways. But, you know, young children have many abstract or non-obvious representations. In a way, what I am finding is just like consistent with a lot of what we know of what happens in early childhood. Children reason about mental states, causality, number, morality, absent entities, imaginary entities. These are all well established as representations that kids have early in childhood. So I think on some level, the standard developmental story is backwards. It's not completely backwards, but I'm going to like kind of push a point to you know, provide a way of understanding these results, which is in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways going beyond the obvious can be easy. And these are like the ways that we've seen with young kids. And I do think that sticking with the here and now can be very hard. I mean, it's hard to ignore categorical information when it competes with individuating information. When you can look at something and you know its category membership, that brings to mind a rich representation that, you know, may not be there in that individual but still affects our behavior. And I think it's hard to ignore object history to evaluate items on their own merits. You know, you see an object and it was, you know, it fell into a sewer and it's picked out. There's a way you can't unsee that when you think about the object. So I think there are a couple of implications, you know, of course, implications for children's thinking, which is what I've been focused on, but a couple of other implications as well. So one has to do with kind of the big philosophical question of how it is that humans come to know the world. What does knowledge consist of and where does it come from? And I believe that knowledge is not strictly built up from piecemeal from sensory or perceptual observations. That's not the whole explanation for what this process is. And the other piece is that cognition is deeply social. So if you think about it, you know, all of these non-obvious concepts require some kind of social input because you can't just figure that all out on your own. Children can't just rely on information from their own senses to build up these representations. So, and we know from a lot of recent research that kids are very attentive to other people as sources of information and testimony to them. So thank you.